A former UN Secretary General once stated that the United Nations was not created to take mankind into paradise, but rather to save humanity from hell. Anyone who has watched a nature documentary can tell you that the natural state of the world is not based off of cuddles and rainbows, but rather red in tooth and claw. The fate of so many creatures that cohabitate this planet with us oftentimes ends at the hands of a violent death. The natural world is not run by common law, civic law, or criminal law, but rather the law of the jungle, the strongest of the fittest. Mother Nature is an abusive parent. Humans, being one of Mother Nature's many children, also succumb to some of her worst impulses. Anyone who has read about history or watched a history documentary can also tell you that it is indeed red. Not necessarily in tooth and claw, but by sword, spear, and shrapnel. Philosopher Hobbes called man's early hunter days being quote-unquote nasty, brutish, and short. James Madison, the primary author of the US Constitution, stated, quote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor external controls on government would be necessary. In framing of the government, which is to be administered by men over men, the greatest difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and then, the next phase, oblige itself to control itself." Now the same goes for nation states. Man came out of the Darwinian law of the jungle, giving up on hunting and gathering, in sharp contrast to nearly all the other beasts, in favor of agriculture, which eventually led to civilization. However, civilization was not always civil. Governments set up by humans to rule over humans oftentimes ended up being almost, if not more, brutal than the food chain found in the savannas of East Africa that man thought it once left behind. You can take the human out of the savanna, but you cannot take the savanna out of the human. Or can you? Over time, the clashes of tribes, chiefdoms, city-states, and empires led to a growing realization that began to emerge. Perhaps this maelstrom of violence and subjugation could be assuaged. Sometimes this was done through the use of religious teachings, although that too could be turned into a form of bloodshed itself through the use of fundamentalism. Sometimes it was done through strong leadership, although a strong leader can oftentimes subjugate others. Over the course of time, there was a slow, ever slow shift from zero-sum games, kill or be killed, to, hey, how about we not kill each other and just get along? This is to say, with a lot of bumps and setbacks along the way, but there was steady progress nonetheless during certain periods of history. Empires rose and fell, but then came the 20th century, and a Pandora's box of horrors was released. The battlefields of World War I were hellscapes that the preachers of old could only imagine. The Great War's aftermath saw the demise of several empires, but a glimmer of hope would emerge as the US President Woodrow Wilson would set up 14 points, which involved self-determination for all Europeans, focused on the European part, as colonized people from the global south were not included, viewed as backward brown people, unfortunately. This nonetheless led to the League of Nations, the first intergovernmental organization set up to maintain order and peace. The League had some successes, managing small-scale conflicts, reducing poverty and disease. However, it failed to bring nations together as major powers, such as the Soviet Union, which joined and left, alongside fascist members of Italy, Japan, and Germany, whose imperialism gnawed at the international order. Not to mention that the two main countries that were running the show were Britain and France, two countries that had a long history of imperialism themselves. And what about the country that came up with this entire idea? Well, the United States didn't actually join as Congress refused to sign on, despite Woodrow Wilson's wishes. When World War II broke out, it was clear that the League was in shambles, as the horrors of the bloodiest conflict in human history came to fruition. Mother Nature's brutality was combined with the state-of-the-art technology to produce a chapter in human history that makes the aforementioned savannas of the Serengeti look like an episode of Sesame Street. However, some did not give up on the idea of a united body to bring about the world together. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, towards the end of World War II, racked with polio, began alongside his contemporaries to plan out a vision for the world that would not succumb to humanity's worst impulses. He unfortunately died before he could see it, shortly before the war in Europe ended. By the end of World War II, the United Nations was established with the aim of preventing future world wars during the San Francisco Conference, with 51 founding members, a number that has quadrupled since then. FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, played a pivotal role in setting up the UN Charter for Human Rights. This set up the foundation for humanitarian aid and economic development, along with other factors that could be preserved for future generations, most of all, a basis for international law. Now, international law is in many ways an oxymoron, as while each country has a degree of rule of law within its own borders, at the end of the day, the world is in a state of anarchy, law of the jungle, if you will, or perhaps law of the savannah. The UN completely changed this dynamic, sort of. Oftentimes, the strong still do as they will, and the weak suffer as they must. However, the UN did assuage the law of the jungle. While the Cold War pitted the two most powerful nations against each other, the US and the USSR, along with their allies and proxies, the UN did have some limited success. The first major conflict after World War II was the Korean War, in which the North Koreans invaded the South Koreans, prompting a UN coalition of various countries to push back the North. Most of the troops were American, followed by British, Canadian, and Turkish forces alongside their South Korean allies. Through a brutal conflict that pushed the North Koreans out and pushed even further north, leading to a close border dispute with China. Eventually, the Chinese communists pushed through, and the conflict ended at the current parallel. To this day, North and South Korea have not had a real peace treaty, just a ceasefire. This was one of those conflicts in which imperialism was halted, but the core premise of the conflict had not been resolved, which is still recurring to this day and will continue with other conflicts. Another high-profile incident was the 1947 resolution to partition Palestine, along with the creation of Israel, which resulted in the first major Arab-Israeli war, in which Israel survived and the Palestinian state did not come to fruition. The conflict still exists to this day. Again, the UN did not lead to the Promised Land in this case, let alone the Holy Land, but it did prevent full-blown hell on earth. It did prevent Armageddon. Another high-profile conflict in the Middle East was the Suez Crisis, in which the leader of Egypt, Nasser, had nationalized the Suez Canal, which led to a joint invasion of Egypt by Britain, France, and Israel. This prompted threats of nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union, which in turn made the US demand the three nations to withdraw from Egypt. This humiliation marked the end of Britain and France as superpowers, as well as the beginnings of the US-Israel alliance. The Canadian Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, at the time, also intervened, bringing in peacekeeping troops into the region to quell tensions, marking the first major peacekeeping mission. The UN would make peacekeeping one of its major roles in various conflicts around the world, staffing their forces less with Canadians these days and more with soldiers from developing countries like Bangladesh, Fiji, and others. While Britain and France got dragged into the place of second-rate powers by the US and USSR, many of their colonies, alongside the colonies of other European empires, demanded independence. During the 1950s and 60s, much of Africa and Asia had thrown off the yoke of European colonialism. Through this, the number of nation-states at the UN expanded rapidly. This influence of the Third World, if you could call it that, led to the People's Republic of China being given a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, replacing the Western-backed Republic of China, also known as Taiwan. This was much to the chagrin of the United States. Now, many of these Third World nations preferred to stay neutral during the Cold War. However, many of them did lean one way or the other. Many of these new developing nations had messy borders, civil wars, and despotic regimes, which the UN was able to mitigate to varying degrees. Over the course of time, the UN steered away from deciding on the guilt or innocence of various factions and conflicts, but rather just tried to sue for peace, creating settlements between various factions and conflicts all around the world, from Cyprus to Sudan, Cambodia to the Congo, during the Cold War and afterwards. Now, in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US remained the world's only sole superpower. And with geopolitical tensions lessened, the UN had more power to flex its influence. The UN helped end the Salvadoran Civil War, a sub-conflict of the Cold War, along with helping to enact sanctions against apartheid South Africa, which eventually ended in 1994. In 1990, Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded Kuwait, annexing the entire territory of a sovereign nation, an act that has been very rare since World War II, not seen since its kind since China conquered Tibet in 1950. This prompted a UN approval of a US-backed coalition of various Western and Arab states to kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwaiti territory, while at the same time not actually conquering Iraq. President George H.W. Bush at the time called this the New World Order, one in which larger nations did not steal territory from smaller nations, and border changes had to be made through diplomacy. However, later interventions by the UN were a mixed bag, as they oftentimes failed to bring an end to a conflict, such as was seen in Somalia. Somalia had an intervention that was led by the UN, but it proved to be an utter catastrophe, and Somalia is a failed state to this day. A mass killing in Rwanda broke out in 1994 as well, and the UN sent forces there that were rather underfunded and understaffed. The UN peacekeeping mission operations proved to be inept, and as a result of this, over 500,000 people had been slaughtered. The conflict and the slaughter did not end until the Rwandan forces that were Tutsi managed to fight back, rather than the UN forces. A similar conflict emerged in the Balkans, as Yugoslavia was falling apart, and Serbian paramilitary troops in Bosnia were slaughtering Bosniaks and Croats, along with other people groups like the Roma. UN forces had been guarding one village called Srebrenica. This unfortunately led to Serbian forces moving into the camp and slaughtering 8,000 Bosniak men and boys. This was utterly humiliating for the UN, and as a result, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization led by the United States had to step in and crushed Serbian forces, and the UN eventually had to put Serbian war criminals on trial. Serbian nationalists 4 years later would engage in an ethnic cleansing spree in Kosovo against ethnic Albanians, some of whom were terrorists but most of whom were civilians. But due to Russia's veto of any resolution that would harm their ally, the Yugoslav government led by Serbian nationalists, the UN was essentially neutered in the conflict, prompting NATO to act without UN approval, bombing Serbian positions and ending the conflict. It was illegal, but it was also effective in ending the slaughter. These conflicts in Africa and the Balkans gave the impression in the minds of many, namely American neoconservatives, that the UN was weak, ineffective, and naive, too dependent on autocrats like Russia and China, and that the US as a result should act unilaterally. This would prove to be very controversial. Nonetheless, other UN interventions did have some major powers backing it, such as those in Sierra Leone, which was backed by the British military, and in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the UN approved the US/NATO-led military intervention in Afghanistan, which was a retaliation against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban government in Afghanistan, which was backing them up. However, the US eventually lost much of its goodwill in 2003, when the US invaded Iraq without the approval of the UN, and under bullshit pretenses, as the supposed weapons of mass destruction ended up not existing in Iraq. This showed that the UN was not able to stop major powers from engaging in preemptive wars of aggression, and tended to be better suited for dealing with obscure conflicts in weak African states like Sudan or the Congo, where there was less strategic interest by great powers. Conflicts continued to ravage failed states like Syria, and the UN approved NATO intervention in Libya that did end the Libyan civil war, and the region's brutal dictator Gaddafi ended up leading to absolute chaos in a country without a stable government. On top of that, in 2014, the UN was not able to prevent Russia from stealing Crimea from Ukraine. And in 2022, given that Russia had a permanent seat at the UN Security Council, the UN couldn't really do much to prevent Russia from taking over large swaths of Ukraine, even though only a grand total of 5 countries on the planet actually supported the invasion of Ukraine. Now, I know mentioning all of this makes it sound like I'm presenting the UN as some sort of failure, but I'm actually not. These were all incredibly messy conflicts. We tend to think that most wars end like World War II, with a complete victory for the quote-unquote good guys. But in most cases, it ends up with a stalemate or a treaty that is based off of compromise, with destruction that takes years to rebuild from, and tensions that remain for decades, if not generations. The UN's track record on armed conflict was mixed, and continues to be mixed, but it has had more success when it comes to sustainable and economic development, alongside women's rights and public health. Several epidemics have been quashed by the UN's Public Health Wing, the World Health Organization based in Switzerland, which successfully eradicated smallpox, the disease that wiped out many of the Native Americans. Today, this demonic bacteria is only found in 2 labs in the US and Russia. During the Cold War, the US and Russia's predecessor, the USSR, teamed up together in spite of their many grievances to defeat one of humanity's greatest enemies. Polio was also nearly eradicated thanks to the vaccine. HIV infections in Africa were limited through UN interventions when it came to education, safe sex, and medication. Malaria, an illness that has probably killed more humans than nearly anything else, has now been reduced to a small set of swampy places in tropical Africa. The number of democracies have expanded, and women's rights, along with the rights of religious and ethnic minorities in various countries, have improved like never before. So maybe the UN isn't very good at dealing with war, but it's pretty damn good at dealing with peace. Keep in mind that by promoting pluralism, expanding access to food, water, and other material concerns can be a major indicator of the reduction of armed conflicts, as many of these conflicts are not simply caused by ideological concerns, although that is certainly the case in many cases, but many are also caused by material and resource concerns. So now that we've talked about the brief overview of the history, let's go to how this organization actually operates. The UN Charter breaks the organization down into a couple of main bodies. The first is the General Assembly, which is the main body of the UN, including all nations. This, in many ways, is the closest thing we have to a world democracy, in which all nations have an equal say. The UN headquarters is based in New York City. After all, this was an American idea, and the US is still the most powerful nation, showing how even a major multinational organization is still playing at the end of the day on the rules of the largest power player. After all, the General Assembly's resolutions are non-binding, unlike that of the UN Security Council, which is the most powerful branch of the UN, in which the power to adopt binding resolutions such as peacekeeping operations, military action, and sanctions actually does take place. The Security Council holds 5 permanent member states. Those are the US, the Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, formerly the Republic of China, as well as the UK and France. These countries were the major winners of World War II, except for France, which we just kind of keep in there because they think they're more important than they actually are. Just kidding, France, you're important. Anyway, all 5 of these have veto powers. There are also 10 non-permanent members which rotate. The 5 permanent members set up this system because they were the victors, and they wanted to exercise more power on the world stage than others. It's true that not everyone else gets the veto power, and this has led to quite a lot of criticism as it stifles the process, such as the UN invasion of Iraq or Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Some countries like Germany, India, and Japan have argued that they should be permanent member states, and that the number of seats should expand. I would argue that the entire concept of the veto stifles the world process as a whole, allowing one big bully to flex their will in defiance of the international community. But hey, after all, the strong do as they will. The next branch of the UN is the Economic and Social Council, which in my opinion is probably the most effective. It is broken down into 15 agencies, covering nearly everything from, say, agriculture, oceans, labor, education, science, technology, manufacturing, and finance, as well as the aforementioned World Health Organization. They even cover intellectual property and tourism. The most controversial agencies are related to financing, namely the World Bank, which is seen as an organization helping developing countries prosper and engage in fiscal responsibility. However, others view it as a tool by Western nations to force developing countries into austere economic policies in exchange for low interest rates and loans that don't necessarily pull them out of poverty but put them into debt. This is a highly controversial subject, and there's still an ongoing debate, which you are free to look up more information on and come to your own conclusion. Now, there's also another similar body called the International Monetary Fund, which operates from Europe and plays a similar role to the World Bank, but maintains more independence. For such a massive influential body, the Economic and Social Council is not a household name. And by the way, not all of these agencies are located in New York City. Many are located in other cities, most notably the World Health Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. There are also even some major offices, such as ones in Nairobi, Kenya. Now let's move on to international law, if you could call it that. There is the International Court of Justice, which contains a panel of 15 judges elected by the Security Council and General Assembly. This, after all, acts as the judicial system of the UN. The purpose of this court is to settle disputes between different countries. The court is located in The Hague in the Netherlands. Most of these cases are pretty boring and low profile, usually settling disputes over river systems, small patches of territory, and by and large are seen as sort of low-level conflicts, if you could call them that don't actually involve violence, but rather countries that are trying to take out their differences in a civilized manner through a legal process. On the other hand, you get the International Criminal Court, also located in The Hague. This actually trials not countries, but individuals. For example, some of the most high-profile cases have been of Serbian war criminals during the Balkan Wars. There's also a UN Secretariat. While the courts act as the judicial branch, the UN General Assembly and the Security Councils kind of act like the legislative branches, kind of like the US House of Representatives and Senate, respectively. The Secretariat kind of acts like the executive branch, and the chief executive is the UN Secretary General. Kind of like a president, if you could call it that. You can see parallels between the American system of government and the UN structure. After all, it is located in New York City. Perhaps you could call him the CEO, but this would be highly controversial. The UN Secretary General acts as a kind of head of state of the UN. He has a lot of power, but not quite the same level of power as major world leaders have. At least not the big nations. Now, the last organ of the United Nations is the Trustee Council, which I could go into detail on, but at this point it's inactive. It's a mostly outdated structure of the League of Nations, dealing with various European colonies, and this has been by and large inactive due to many of those countries getting independence. By the time the obscure Pacific island nation of Palau became independent, this branch pretty much became irrelevant. As you can probably tell by now, the UN is about as powerful as many of the nations in it give it power. This is a far cry from many of the conspiracy theories you hear about the United Nations. In conclusion, the world is, at the end of the day, a jungle. But this time it's a jungle with rangers. Perhaps if, say, China and Russia became democracies, then maybe the world would be a far more functioning place. Maybe a garden. Although perhaps even that's too optimistic. However, it's worth mentioning that we live in one of the most peaceful times in human history. Throughout human prehistory, hunter-gatherers were raiding each other. Then we had warring states, empires, and modern states. Today, interstate conflict still exists, but it's less common. Most of the conflicts today have been relegated to civil wars in less developed nations, with a few exceptions. There have also been less instances of countries stealing territory from others, again, with a few exceptions. There are multiple reasons for this: the unipolar world order, the trade interdependence, changing political and ethical norms, as well as people just not really liking getting killed. That's probably the biggest one of all. The UN has not stopped the bloodshed, but it has mitigated this. The author Robert Wright, in his book Non-Zero, claimed that over the course of human history, we've shifted away from zero-sum games to non-zero-sum games. The UN, contrary to what many conspiracy theories state, is not a cover-up for the Freemasons or the Illuminati government takeover, but rather a large step in what I believe to be the right direction. One out of the jungle and out of Mother Nature's laws. But perhaps Mother Nature was not as bad of a parent as we once thought, for after all, she produced children that, with a lot of trial and failures, have over a long period of time and many setbacks, managed to see the error of their ways.